Now, we've seen in previous lectures and also in the rusty nail example that there are a string of potential determinants of health outcomes that are involved in any particular event. And the topic of this week's lecture is to investigate one particular framework or issue that determines health outcomes, and that is this idea of inequity. So that there's certain socioeconomic, cultural, and other factors which are unequal within populations and therefore lead to some sort of unfair disadvantage in terms of people's ability or opportunity to lead a healthful life. So this is what we're going to be covering in this lecture. Essentially, we'll need to, again, start off with some definitions. Health promotion and public health is very much dependent initially on defining what it is we're actually talking about. So we'll define inequality and how it relates to inequity. We'll also be looking at various examples of social inequities and inequalities in health. So there's some clear examples where this, in fact, is the case. So firstly, we need to, again, revise what it is we mean by health. So a complete state of physical, mental, or psychological, and social well-being. Okay, not just the absence of disease or infirmity. And that's a very important definition of health. It's one that's been in play since the late 40s, so it's not something new, and it's basically a holistic definition of health. And this is very important to get this right. To when we do describe what health is, that it's more than just whether or not you're sick. It's actually a much more broad definition now. The other thing that we covered earlier was this diagram where we're looking at the various stages along a life cycle, and I mentioned again that first 1,000 days of life being these days particularly important. That's where a lot of work is going on in terms of this science of epigenetics that you might hear about. It's largely centered around that first in utero experience. But at every stage during the life cycle, there are various outcomes, health outcomes, and equally at every stage of the life cycle, there are various determinants which are at play. And if we think about the inequality and inequity in health, most of the factors that we're going to be looking at occur around this outside. So especially employment, income, education, your family, where, so geography of where you are, all these various political and social stability, housing, they're all factors which come into play with inequity and inequality. So let's look at this first definition. Health equality is a generic term, and we're looking at measurable differences between individuals and groups. And it's important to reflect again on this definition of health, because some of the things that we talk about, social well-being, for example, is actually quite difficult to measure. So it becomes quite a challenge to actually talk about inequality if we're looking at this holistic definition of health. And a further definition of inequality is variations in health status among different groups in a given population. So if we have a population that you would think should have relatively equal opportunities for a healthy and active life, if you find specific groups within the population that have good health, medium health, and bad health, then this is inequality. And some of these inequalities are the result of inequities, and we'll have a look at what inequity is. In short, inequity reflects on whether or not this difference is actually fair or just. If it's unjust or unfair, then it's termed an inequity. And some of the inequalities that are related to health outcomes are listed in this table. So there's this so-called class. So if we think about level of skill and education, we see that low-income earners and unskilled labourers are actually most at risk in terms of health outcomes. Gender, depending on the actual outcome indicator we're looking at, so for example, men have highest rates of suicide, but lower rates of mental illness. There's also a so-called race. So in Australia, for example, Indigenous populations, on every health indicator, Indigenous populations have a far higher incidence and prevalence rate of disease and have a far shorter expectation for life. Also ethnicity. So we can look at, for example, of immigrants that come from non-English speaking backgrounds in Australia. They have, for the most part, they have much higher prevalence of certain diseases, and this is especially true for most recent immigrants, for example, refugees. For a range of reasons, they have quite higher rates of disease and much lower life expectancy. So, as I mentioned previously, in a couple of slides ago, inequity is an inequality that is deemed to be unfair, either unfair or arising from some form of injustice. Therefore, inequity refers to members of a population having equal opportunities to achieve and maintain health. So, for example, we would expect all Australians to have equal opportunity to achieve and maintain health. Is this the case? Well, the short answer is no. I've already mentioned one group of people, Indigenous, who have a far lower life expectancy, something like 30 years lower than the non-Indigenous population. So we can then look at, well, how do we actually divide up a population or stratify? Stratify is a word that's used quite often in public health, and it basically means how you actually divide a population. So we might divide a population or stratify a population according to age. So you've got an age, say 80 up here, and 0 down here, and basically you can stratify the population according to age groups. But there's a whole range of other ways in which we can stratify populations according to factors which may play a role in health outcomes. So, for example, all societies rank their citizens according to a set of social and cultural criteria. Now you may think to yourself, well, what sorts of things, what sorts of factors could a population be divided up according to? Well, income is one, education's another, and a range of other things, so-called class, employment, unemployment, gender, a whole range of things. And there are some social hierarchies that actually come into play in terms of, for example, income and education are two of the major social hierarchies. And you can very well imagine that income in particular can have significant effects on opportunities for things like living condition, housing, access to education, access to health services, and food. Now, if you remember that case study of Julia who stepped on a nail and died of septicemia, well, one of the reasons why there was a delay in going to hospital, I suspect, is because of expense. It is extremely, even in Australia, it's extremely expensive to access health services, especially if you have a significant problem which requires hospitalisation. But in many developing countries, there's no Medicare, there's no social safety net. It's basically, if you don't have the money, you don't get treated. Now, despite what advocates of individual responsibility in health say, in fact, there is a lot of evidence that social inequality actually is linked to inequity in health. And most of these relationships are associated with living condition and social circumstances. So, health outcomes often reflect one's access to opportunities and conditions conducive to health. So again, if we consider that case study, if we look at injury, the little girl who stepped on a nail, she may not have she didn't have access to local treatment for a range of reasons. Maybe she didn't have, her mother didn't have access to clean water or clean bandages or antiseptic cream, and then she didn't have access to a doctor to have a look at the injury to start with to make sure that it was not infected. And then further on, when she developed complicated symptoms, she didn't have access to hospital services for one reason or another. Now, we didn't know the specifics of it, but it could have been money that was a barrier, or it could have been distance. This girl might have lived in a remote village where it was quite difficult to access a big hospital in the capital city. And from the literature, from a range of studies over at least 50 years, we can see evidence that this relationship between social rank and morbidity and mortality consistently, the higher your social class, the lower the mortality and morbidity. There are exceptions, but these are general statistical trends that are borne out time and time again.